As my heir, William now assumes the Scottish titles which have meant so much to me. He succeeds me as Duke of Cornwall.
At first, it seemed like just another carefully choreographed royal announcement, the kind of moment that Buckingham Palace has managed countless times across generations. Yet behind the polished statements, the formal schedules, and the reassuring language of continuity, a far more unsettling question was beginning to emerge. Why would a monarch who waited a lifetime for the crown suddenly appear ready to surrender it? And if King Charles III truly intended to step aside, what had happened behind palace walls to bring the monarchy to such an extraordinary turning point? Inspired by the reference narrative while creating a completely original structure and wording. For most of his life, King Charles III existed in a state unlike any other royal heir in modern history. While previous heirs eventually ascended to the throne after years of preparation, Charles spent decade after decade watching, learning, waiting, and carrying responsibilities without possessing the authority that comes with the crown itself. Entire generations grew up seeing him as Prince of Wales rather than sovereign. By the time the monarch finally succeeded Queen Elizabeth II, he had already become one of the most recognized figures on the planet, yet paradoxically remained one of the least understood. That reality matters, because understanding the significance of the current moment requires understanding the unusual burden Charles carried for most of his life. The crown was never merely a symbol to him. It represented a destiny postponed repeatedly by circumstances beyond his control. When the throne finally became his, many observers believed they were witnessing the culmination of a story 70 years in the making. Yet what if that long-awaited arrival was also the beginning of a completely different ending? The question became increasingly difficult to ignore as the pressure surrounding the royal family intensified. Public expectations had changed dramatically from the era of Queen Elizabeth II. Media scrutiny moved faster than ever. Every appearance, every statement, every silence generated instant analysis across multiple continents. The institution faced challenges from within and outside its own ranks, while debates about the future relevance of the monarchy became louder than at any point in recent memory. At the same time, another development was quietly reshaping public perception. While King Charles worked to establish his reign, Prince William, the Prince of Wales, and Catherine, Princess of Wales, were gradually becoming the focal point of immense public attention. Their popularity was not simply the result of royal tradition. It reflected something deeper. Many people increasingly viewed the Prince and Princess of Wales as representatives of the monarchy's future rather than its present. But was that growing perception creating a dilemma few were willing to discuss openly? After all, history has shown that monarchies depend heavily on timing. Move too slowly, and institutions appear disconnected from modern realities. Move too quickly, and they risk destabilizing the continuity that gives them legitimacy. Somewhere between those competing pressures lies a difficult question. At what point does preparing the next generation become more important than preserving the current one? Observers began noticing subtle signs that the center of gravity inside the royal household appeared to be shifting. Major public engagements increasingly highlighted William and Catherine's leadership roles. International appearances attracted significant attention. Public reaction remained overwhelmingly positive. Polling consistently suggested strong support for the future king and future queen. Yet this growing confidence around the next generation raised another question that few commentators could answer. How did King Charles himself view the situation? Some royal analysts argue that Charles, perhaps more than anyone else, understood the importance of long-term institutional stability. Others suggested that a monarch who spent decades waiting for the throne would naturally wish to maximize every possible year of his reign. Both interpretations seemed plausible. Both could not be entirely correct. And that is where the story becomes considerably more intriguing. Because according to persistent reports and growing speculation among royal watchers, conversations taking place behind closed doors were no longer focused solely on day-to-day royal duties. Increasing attention was being directed toward succession planning, future responsibilities, and the practical realities facing a monarchy navigating a rapidly changing world. Whether those discussions represented ordinary contingency planning or something far more significant remains a matter of debate. However, one fact is difficult to overlook. Institutions rarely begin discussing transitions without a reason. Then there was the issue of health. While Buckingham Palace continued emphasizing the king's commitment to duty, public concern inevitably grew whenever questions about his well-being surfaced. Such concerns were not unique to Charles. Every reigning monarch eventually faces scrutiny regarding age, stamina, and long-term capacity. Yet in this case, the timing seemed especially sensitive because the future of the monarchy already appeared increasingly tied to William and Catherine's emergence as senior figures. Could these developments be connected? Or were observers simply drawing conclusions from unrelated events? The uncertainty only fueled further speculation. Every appearance generated fresh analysis. Every royal engagement prompted new theories. Every carefully worded palace statement seemed to answer one question while creating two more. Meanwhile, the Prince and Princess of Wales continued performing their duties with remarkable discipline. Catherine's resilience following personal health challenges earned widespread admiration, while William appeared increasingly comfortable occupying a leadership role that many believed would eventually define a new era of monarchy. What made this dynamic especially fascinating was that it created two parallel stories unfolding simultaneously. One concerned the reign of King Charles III. The other concerned the future reign of Prince William and Catherine. For a time, those stories appeared separate. Gradually, however, they seemed to be moving toward the same destination. And if that destination truly involved a transfer of power, then another question becomes unavoidable. Who inside the family supported such a transition, and who might have opposed it? Because succession is never merely a constitutional process, it is also deeply personal. It affects relationships, influence, loyalties, and the balance of power that exists within any royal household. Decisions that appear straightforward from the outside often carry enormous emotional consequences behind closed doors. As whispers of private discussions continued to circulate, attention increasingly turned toward a gathering that reportedly brought together key members of the royal family. What began as a quiet meeting would soon become the focus of intense speculation, not because of what was publicly announced, but because of what may have happened once the doors were closed. And if the accounts emerging from that meeting are even partially accurate, the conversation that followed may have changed the course of the monarchy forever. That is where the next chapter of the story begins. What happened after that reported gathering is where the story begins to move beyond a question of succession and into something far more consequential. Because if the discussion had merely been about timing, public duties, or future planning, it is difficult to explain why royal commentators became increasingly interested in the reactions rather than the decision itself. For decades, the British monarchy has relied upon a principle that rarely appears in official statements but quietly underpins everything the institution does. Stability matters more than personalities. Individual preferences, disagreements, and ambitions are expected to remain secondary to continuity. Yet several observers have noted that the atmosphere surrounding these reported discussions appeared unusually personal, as though something deeper than constitutional planning had entered the conversation. That distinction is important because history shows that monarchies are rarely threatened by public ceremonies. They are tested by private relationships. If reports are accurate, the significance of the meeting was not simply that Charles discussed the future. It was that those closest to him were forced to confront a reality many had previously treated as theoretical. The transition was no longer something that might happen years from now. It was becoming something that required immediate consideration. And that realization created a ripple effect extending far beyond one room. Think for a moment about what such a development would mean inside the royal household. Every institution develops around its leadership structure. Advisors build working relationships. Staff organize priorities. Patronages, projects, and public engagements align themselves with the reigning monarch's vision. When the possibility of transition suddenly accelerates, every one of those structures begins adjusting, often before any formal announcement is made. Royal watchers have long observed that shifts in influence are rarely announced. They are detected: a change in who attends certain meetings, a change in who represents the crown at key events, a change in whose judgment carries increasing weight. These details may appear insignificant individually. Together, however, they can reveal an institution preparing for something larger. That is why many analysts became fascinated by William's position in the weeks and months surrounding these developments. The heir to the throne was no longer simply representing the future. Increasingly, He appeared to be helping manage the present. At first glance, that might seem entirely normal. After all, heirs are expected to assume greater responsibilities over time. Yet some commentators argued that the pace of this evolution felt different. The Prince of Wales was not merely participating. He seemed to be operating with a level of authority usually associated with transitions already underway. But if that interpretation is correct, another question immediately emerges. Was Charles deliberately empowering the next generation, or was the institution responding to circumstances beyond anyone's control? The answer matters because the implications are entirely different. One suggests strategic planning, the other suggests necessity. And necessity can change everything. What makes this situation particularly intriguing is that it unfolds against a backdrop unlike any previous royal transition. Earlier monarchs operated in an age when internal disagreements could remain private for years. Today's royal family exists under constant observation. Every gesture is analyzed. Every appearance generates headlines. Every relationship becomes part of a broader public narrative. That means any significant transition must succeed on two levels simultaneously. It must work institutionally, and it must work emotionally. The public has to accept it. This is where Catherine's role becomes increasingly significant. Several royal commentators have pointed out that discussions about the future monarchy frequently focus on William's position while overlooking the unique role played by the Princess of Wales. Yet public trust in modern royal institutions often depends as much on personal connection as constitutional legitimacy. Catherine's popularity, resilience, and ability to engage audiences across generations have become strategic assets for the monarchy itself. In other words, conversations about succession are no longer solely about who wears the crown. They are about who can sustain confidence in the institution. That distinction may explain why speculation surrounding a future coronation has generated such extraordinary attention. The discussion is not merely about replacing one monarch with another. It is about defining the image of the monarchy for the next several decades. And that raises a larger issue. What happens when public enthusiasm for the future begins to rival public attention toward the present? Historically, royal households have approached that situation with extreme caution. The balance is delicate. An heir must be visible enough to inspire confidence without overshadowing the sovereign. Achieving that balance has challenged monarchies throughout history. Some analysts believe the current situation reflects that very tension. Not conflict in the traditional sense, not rivalry, but an unavoidable reality created by generational change. The king represents continuity. William and Catherine increasingly symbolize renewal. Both are necessary, yet the coexistence of those two forces can create difficult decisions about timing, visibility, and leadership. This may help explain why reports of private discussions generated such interest among royal observers. The conversations themselves were important. The questions they raised were even more important. Because once people begin seriously discussing transition, attention inevitably shifts toward what comes after. And that is where another layer of uncertainty emerges. The monarchy is not simply preparing for a new reign. It is preparing for a new era. Those are not the same thing. A new reign changes leadership. A new era changes expectations. William's generation faces challenges fundamentally different from those encountered by previous monarchs. Public trust must be earned continuously. Traditional deference cannot be assumed. Social media accelerates scrutiny. Global audiences follow royal events in real time. The institution must remain recognizable while adapting to a world that changes faster than ever before. The question, therefore, is no longer whether succession will eventually happen. Everyone knows it will. The real question is whether certain figures inside the institution believe the transition should happen sooner than originally expected. And if they do, what factors are driving that belief? Health concerns are one possibility. Public perception is another. Long-term strategic planning offers a third. Yet some royal analysts have suggested a more complicated explanation. They argue that the discussions may reflect a convergence of pressures rather than a single cause. If true, that would mean the monarchy is responding not to one challenge, but to several simultaneously. That possibility dramatically increases the significance of everything happening behind the scenes. Because institutions can usually manage isolated problems, multiple pressures arriving at once are far more difficult. And there is one detail that continues to attract attention among experienced royal commentators. The reported conversations were not focused exclusively on the next few months. They appeared focused on the next generation. That distinction changes the entire story. Suddenly, this is no longer about one monarch's future. It becomes a question about the future shape of the monarchy itself, the role William and Catherine may ultimately play within it, and the choices being made now that could influence the institution for decades. Yet perhaps the most revealing development has not happened publicly at all. According to several royal observers, attention within certain palace circles has quietly shifted from discussing whether change is coming to discussing how that change would be managed if it arrived sooner than expected. And if that assessment is accurate, then the next stage of a story may involve something far more significant than a private family conversation. It may involve preparations that reveal just how seriously some people are already thinking about what comes next. What makes this story particularly fascinating is that the further we move from the reported discussions themselves, the more it begins to resemble something that has been developing for years rather than weeks. Viewed in isolation, each development can appear ordinary. Viewed together, however, a different pattern starts to emerge, one that may explain why so many royal observers believe the conversation is ultimately about far more than a single decision regarding succession. The first clue lies in timing. Royal institutions rarely act quickly unless circumstances demand it. Their greatest strength has always been patience. Decisions are tested, reconsidered, reviewed, and often delayed. Yet some analysts have noted that the pace of preparation surrounding William and Catherine's expanding role appears unusually deliberate. Not rushed, but purposeful. Almost as though the monarchy has been quietly building toward a future scenario long before the public realized it was under consideration. That observation helps explain why so many commentators focus on preparation rather than announcement. A coronation can be organized. A future monarch must be prepared. Those are entirely different challenges. And when royal watchers examine the past several years through that lens, certain developments begin to look less like isolated events and more like pieces of a larger strategy. Increased international representation, greater visibility during major state occasions, expanding charitable leadership, and a growing willingness to allow the Prince and Princess of Wales to occupy the center of significant public moments all suggest an institution investing heavily in long-term continuity. But that creates another question. If this preparation has been underway for years, what exactly changed recently to make it feel more urgent? Some observers believe the answer may lie in the convergence of pressures discussed earlier. Others argue that something even more significant is taking place behind the scenes. Because monarchies do not simply manage events. They manage confidence, public confidence, institutional confidence, family confidence, and perhaps most importantly, confidence among the people responsible for ensuring the crown remains stable regardless of who wears it. When viewed from that perspective, the reported discussions begin to take on a different meaning. Rather than focusing solely on Charles's future, they may reveal concerns about preserving momentum at a particularly sensitive moment in the monarchy's evolution. Consider the broader context. The institution spent much of the last several decades navigating controversy, public scrutiny, and generational change. During that period, trust became one of its most valuable assets. Trust is difficult to build and remarkably easy to lose. Every modern royal strategy ultimately revolves around protecting it. This may explain why William and Catherine's position has become so strategically important. Their value to the institution extends beyond popularity. Popularity rises and falls. Trust tends to endure longer. Royal commentators have repeatedly pointed out that the couple's public image combines stability with relatability, tradition with modernization. Whether intentional or not, that combination addresses many of the challenges facing contemporary monarchy. And this is where another piece of the puzzle begins to fit. Perhaps the discussion is not simply about whether William is ready to become king. Perhaps it is about whether the monarchy believes the public is already ready to see him in that role. Those are not identical questions. The first concerns capability. The second concerns perception. History shows that perception often determines how smoothly transitions unfold. Several analysts have noted parallels with earlier moments when royal institutions found themselves balancing continuity against changing public expectations. The details differ, of course, but the underlying challenge remains remarkably familiar. How do you preserve tradition while adapting to realities that previous generations never faced? The answer often involves gradual transfer rather than sudden transformation, which may explain why the reported conversations have attracted so much attention among experienced royal correspondents. They appear less concerned with one event than with a process that may already be much further advanced than many people realize. Yet there is another dimension that deserves attention, the human one, because institutional analysis can sometimes obscure the personal realities involved. For Charles, any discussion about transition inevitably carries emotional weight. This is not merely a constitutional matter. It involves a role pursued throughout an entire lifetime. Every public duty, every state visit, every year spent preparing for responsibility ultimately led to the crown. That makes the current speculation particularly remarkable. If there is genuine consideration being given to accelerating the future, it would suggest an extraordinary willingness to place institutional priorities above personal attachment. Some royal watchers believe that possibility reveals something important about Charles's thinking. Others caution that much remains unknown. Both perspectives contain elements of truth. What is increasingly difficult to dismiss, however, is the pattern itself. The pattern suggests planning. The planning suggests intention. And intention raises questions about what developments may still be unfolding beyond public view. This is where the role of internal relationships becomes especially significant. Large institutions often reveal their priorities through alliances rather than announcements. Who works together? Who appears aligned? Who is entrusted with responsibility during sensitive periods? These dynamics frequently provide more insight than official statements ever could. Reports indicate that conversations between key figures within the royal household have become increasingly future-focused. While much of this remains unconfirmed, the consistency of those observations has attracted attention among analysts who normally avoid speculation. Why? Because they may point toward a deeper institutional reality. The monarchy's greatest concern has never been any single reign. It has always been the transition between reigns. Success is measured not by how well one monarch governs, but by how effectively the institution survives the transfer of authority. Seen through that lens, many recent developments begin to look surprisingly coherent. What initially appeared to be separate stories, public engagements, succession discussions, strategic positioning, expanding responsibilities, start connecting into a broader narrative about continuity. Yet one piece of the puzzle remains frustratingly incomplete. If the institution has indeed been preparing for a significant transition, there is still no clear answer to what ultimately accelerated the conversation from long-term planning into immediate relevance. That missing piece matters, because it could change the interpretation of everything we've discussed so far. Was the shift driven primarily by practical considerations? Was it influenced by evolving public expectations? Or was there a specific moment behind closed doors that convinced key figures the timetable itself needed to be reconsidered? Until that question is answered, the picture remains incomplete. And according to several royal observers, the next development may provide exactly the clue that has been missing. Because attention is now turning toward a series of private decisions that, if interpreted correctly, may reveal whether this story is truly about succession, or about something even larger taking shape within the monarchy itself. What began as a series of questions about succession was now producing something much more significant, visible signs that different parts of the institution were responding to the same underlying reality. Not publicly, not dramatically, and certainly not in a way that Buckingham Palace would ever frame as unusual, but in ways that suggested preparations were no longer existing solely in the realm of theory. The most revealing aspect was not any single decision. It was the accumulation of decisions. Royal commentators have often noted that major constitutional transitions rarely announce themselves in advance. Instead, they reveal themselves through a pattern of adjustments that only become obvious when viewed together. A responsibility moves from one figure to another. Certain consultations begin involving different people. Strategic discussions expand to include voices that previously occupied more limited roles. Each development appears routine. The collective picture is far more revealing. That may explain why increasing attention has been directed toward the relationship between authority and responsibility within the monarchy. Historically, those two things have not always moved at the same speed. Formal authority belongs to the sovereign. Practical responsibility can begin shifting long before a transition officially occurs. Some analysts have argued that this distinction may be critical to understanding what is happening now. If William is being entrusted with a growing share of institutional responsibilities, the significance extends beyond workload. It suggests confidence. More importantly, it suggests confidence from the people whose primary concern is the long-term stability of the crown. And confidence creates momentum. Once key stakeholders begin viewing someone as the future center of continuity, their decisions naturally start reinforcing that perception. Not because of a formal directive, but because institutions tend to organize themselves around anticipated realities. This is where the various strands of a story begin converging. The reported succession discussions, the expanding public role of the Prince and Princess of Wales, the growing focus on long-term planning, the recurring emphasis on continuity rather than change. Individually, each development raises questions. Together, they begin pointing toward a common destination. Yet perhaps the most important consequence is not what these developments reveal about William and Catherine. It is what they reveal about the pressures facing Charles. Because the monarch now occupies a uniquely difficult position. Every decision must balance two competing obligations. On one side lies personal commitment to duty. On the other lies responsibility to ensure the institution remains strong long after his reign eventually concludes. Normally those objectives align comfortably. Under certain circumstances, however, they can begin pulling in different directions. Several royal watchers have suggested that this may be the tension at the center of the entire story. Not a conflict between individuals, not a struggle for influence, a conflict between timelines, the timeline of a reigning monarch, and the timeline of an institution preparing for its future. That distinction matters because it changes how recent developments are interpreted. Actions that initially appeared reactive begin looking strategic. Discussions that seem speculative begin appearing practical. The focus shifts from personalities toward priorities, and the institution's priorities are becoming increasingly clear. Stability, continuity, public confidence, long-term legitimacy. Everything appears to be flowing back toward those objectives. But there is another consequence emerging from this convergence, one that receives far less attention. Expectation. The more visible William and Catherine become, the more public expectations begin attaching themselves to the future rather than the present. This creates opportunities, but it also creates risks. Expectations can strengthen institutions when fulfilled. They can become sources of pressure when delayed. Royal commentators have noted that public anticipation surrounding the next generation appears unusually strong. In some respects, that is a tremendous advantage. In other respects, it introduces a question that palace strategists cannot ignore. How long can anticipation continue growing before it begins influencing broader conversations about timing? No official statement addresses that question directly. Yet it remains present beneath much of the current discussion. The consequence is a subtle but important shift in perception. Increasingly, observers are not merely asking what happens next. They are asking when. And once timing becomes part of the conversation, every development acquires greater significance. A routine engagement becomes a signal. A leadership role becomes evidence. A private discussion becomes a potential indicator of larger decisions being considered behind closed doors. Whether those interpretations are correct remains uncertain. What is certain is that they are becoming more common. At the same time, reports suggest that those closest to the institution have become increasingly focused on managing expectations. That response itself is revealing. Institutions rarely devote energy to managing conversations that they consider entirely irrelevant, which raises another intriguing possibility. What if the growing speculation is not being fueled solely by public interest? What if some of it reflects recognition that genuine decisions may eventually have to be made? That possibility helps explain why reactions have become so important. Every reaction reveals priorities. Every priority reveals pressure, and pressure inevitably forces choices. The deeper the story progresses, the less it resembles a debate about whether change is coming, and the more it resembles a discussion about how change should be handled when it arrives. That shift is subtle, but it is enormously significant, because once an institution begins concentrating on management rather than possibility, it often means the conversation has entered a new phase. a phase where consequences matter more than predictions, a phase where planning becomes increasingly difficult to separate from preparation. And according to several analysts, there is one final factor now drawing attention among those who follow royal affairs most closely. It is not a speech. It is not an announcement. It is not even a public appearance. It is the growing belief that a decisive moment may already have occurred behind the scenes, a moment that caused multiple strands of planning, responsibility, and expectation to accelerate at the same time. If that assessment proves correct, then everything discussed so far, from succession planning to institutional confidence, from public trust to leadership preparation, may ultimately trace back to a single turning point that has not yet been fully understood. And if that turning point can be identified, it may fundamentally change how the entire story is interpreted, because the next stage is no longer about what the monarchy is preparing for. It is about why certain people may have concluded that preparation could no longer wait. And this is where the deeper meaning of the story finally begins to emerge. Because after following every thread, examining every implication, and considering every reported development, the central question is no longer whether a transition might occur. The more revealing question is why so many experienced royal observers believe this moment represents something larger than a single change in leadership. The answer may lie in the nature of modern monarchy itself. For most of British history, the institution relied heavily on permanence. Monarchs reigned for decades. Transitions were rare. The public became accustomed to long periods of stability, punctuated by historic moments of succession. Yet the environment surrounding today's royal family is fundamentally different. Expectations move faster. Public attention shifts more quickly. The pressure to remain relevant, visible, and trusted has never been greater. Viewed through that lens, the significance of recent developments becomes clearer. This was never simply a conversation about one king and one heir. It was a conversation about whether the monarchy is entering a new phase of adaptation. Several royal commentators have suggested that the institution increasingly behaves less like a static symbol and more like a long-term organization focused on sustainability. That does not mean abandoning tradition. Quite the opposite. It means protecting tradition by ensuring it can survive modern realities. And if that interpretation is correct, then many of the developments discussed throughout the story begin fitting together in a remarkably coherent way. The growing responsibilities, the emphasis on preparation, the focus on continuity, the careful management of public trust, none of these appear accidental. They resemble the actions of an institution looking beyond immediate circumstances toward the next several decades. That realization changes how the story is understood. At the beginning, the possibility of Charles stepping aside appeared to be the central issue. Now it feels more like a lens through which a much larger transformation can be observed. Because the monarchy's greatest challenge has never been preserving the present. It has always been preparing for the future without destabilizing the present in the process. That balancing act is extraordinarily difficult. Move too slowly and momentum fades. Move too quickly and continuity suffers. The institution must somehow accomplish both at once. Some analysts have argued that this challenge explains why William and Catherine have attracted such intense attention. Their importance extends beyond personal popularity or public affection. They increasingly represent a bridge between generations. One foot remains firmly planted in tradition. The other is positioned in a future that looks very different from the one previous monarchs inherited. That role carries enormous opportunity. It also carries enormous responsibility, because expectations rarely decrease after succession. They increase. The future king will inherit not only the crown but also the expectations attached to it. Catherine will face similar pressures. Every strength currently praised by the public will eventually be tested by the realities of leadership itself. And that may be one of the most overlooked aspects of this entire story. Preparation is not evidence of certainty. Preparation is evidence of responsibility. The monarchy understands that the future cannot be controlled. It can only be prepared for. Which brings us back to Charles. If reports suggesting greater attention to succession planning contain any truth, they may reveal something significant about how the king views his role. Rather than defining success solely through the length of a reign, success may increasingly be measured through the condition in which the institution is passed to the next generation. That is a very different understanding of legacy. It places continuity above personal achievement. Institution above individual. Future above present. Whether one agrees with that philosophy or not, it helps explain why discussions about succession attract so much attention among those who study royal affairs closely. They are not merely observing a possible transfer of authority. They are observing how an ancient institution thinks about survival. And survival remains the key word. The British monarchy has endured because each generation eventually faced the same question: how much should change, and how much must remain the same? Every era answers differently. Every monarch confronts the question under different circumstances. William's generation may face it more intensely than any generation before. Public expectations continue evolving. Media scrutiny remains relentless. Trust must be maintained continuously rather than assumed automatically. The institution must remain recognizable while adapting to realities that previous centuries never encountered. That challenge will not disappear after any future coronation. In many respects, it will only begin. This is why some royal watchers believe the true significance of the current moment has little to do with individual announcements and much to do with institutional direction. The story reveals a monarchy thinking ahead, planning ahead, positioning itself for challenges that may not fully emerge for years. And that broader perspective may ultimately prove more important than any specific development currently attracting headlines. Because history often remembers transitions differently than contemporaries experience them. People living through a moment focus on events. History tends to focus on meaning. Years from now, historians may spend less time debating individual conversations and more time examining what those conversations revealed about the monarchy's priorities at a critical point in its evolution. Were these developments evidence of unusual circumstances, or were they early signs of a more strategic, forward-looking approach to royal leadership? That question remains open, and perhaps it should remain open. After all, the immediate situation may eventually become clear through official announcements, future decisions, and the passage of time. What remains uncertain is something larger. When future generations look back on this period, will they see it as a routine chapter in the ongoing story of the crown? Or will they see it as the moment when the monarchy quietly began redefining how it prepares for the future while remaining rooted in the traditions that made it endure in the first place? That may be the real story hidden beneath everything we've explored. Not simply the possibility of one reign ending and another beginning, but the question of how an institution centuries old continues adapting to a world that never stops changing. And perhaps the most interesting question of all is this: will history remember this as an isolated royal development, or as one of the earliest signs of a broader transformation in how the monarchy approaches succession, leadership, and its future place in modern society? If you enjoyed this deep dive into the royal family, Prince William, Catherine, Princess of Wales, King Charles III, Princess, and the future of the monarchy, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next royal analysis. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'll see you in the next video.